streaming. No longer have the problems we once had because I switched to an entirely different streaming software and the channel is now live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I don't remember if that's how I've introduced this episode before because I kind of did it the way I do so many levels. How's everybody else? I'm Christiana Ellis.
I'm Mike Mateen.
And we are talking about movies. And so in our last episode, what we decided that we would focus on, what this all started as, is a brief discussion about if you were going to choose between Paul Verhoeven's best movies, would it be RoboCop or Starship Troopers? And then the idea of, well, what about Total Recall got thrown in there for discussion. So we just decided this episode is all about saying, pick one. RoboCop, Total Recall, or Starship Troopers. What's it going to be? So, we have already done an episode about Starship Troopers back when we did war movies. It was one of the three that we talked about. So, we aren't going to necessarily go through that one in too much detail, although I'm sure discussion points about it will come up. But what do you think? Do we want to just touch on RoboCop and Total Recall as like generalized discussions? Do we just want to just run right into how do we compare them? What are we comparing it based on?
I think it would be cool without getting into that. Maybe it would be cool to just kind of. I know you've rewatched them more recently than I have, but maybe just a quick, like, hey, how do they hold up? Like, what do
Mm-hmm.
we think about them, independent of them as Paul Verhoeven movies?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like 5-10 minutes on each one, and then get in the
Sure.
most. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, so my take on these movies, and I actually did just in the, before we even decided to do this episode, I had rewatched all three, partly because another film podcast that I enjoy is called the Blank Check Podcast, and I was going through their backlog, and they did their series on Paul Verhoeven, and so I was kind of watching along with them. Move my microphone stand so I'm pointing in the right direction, and so I rewatched the three as part of that, and not only those three, but like all of Paul Verhoeven's movies. And I do feel comfortable saying that I think these are the three that I like the most. Although there's some other good ones in there, um, and he always makes interesting movies, regardless.
Yes.
But I think of these three, which I as established, I think are my favorite three of his filmography. RoboCop, of course, is 1980s classic sci-fi where you have a sort of near future dystopic Detroit, and various corporations are juggling for control over the city, and the police department is kind of struggling to keep up against the crime due to funding and various legal squabbles, and all of that plays into the idea that one particular corporate uh, entity, this guy who works at one of these corporations, has his plan for a new robotic, like military type police robot that's designed to go in and basically police the streets, but it's not working quite right. It's not ready yet. And so because that presentation kind of falls on its face in one of the best scenes of the movie, which we'll talk more about in a bit, I'm sure, we have the next guy in line looking to try to make his own presentation has the thing he's been working on, which is instead of making a whole robot from scratch, what if we take, a human and like roboticize him and have that be, the RoboCop? And so as part of that, in order to make it happen, they have to have a willing candidate who meets the right criteria. And so they find a guy and they make it happen, and by hiring a bunch of criminals. I guess actually, if I recall correctly, it isn't. They don't like pick him out and target him. It's coincidence, but it works out that way. Meaning we have Officer Murphy who essentially gets killed in a particularly brutal way, and they decide he would die, he would be legally dead. Therefore, in this future dystopian Detroit, they decide, well, that means we get him then. you know, he loses all of his rights because he's dead. So we're just going to take his body now and make him into RoboCop. And then, of course, the rest of the movie is his struggles to try to remember who he once was, to see if he can recover any sort of memories or agency over himself, and to determine whether or not the corporate bad guys get what's coming to them. There's also a bunch of criminals that are awful, like the criminals that killed Murphy in the first place. And there's a lot of violence and a lot of satire dealing with, the what does TV look like in this scenario, this version of Detroit, and the various corporate squabblings and all of that sort of thing. Lots going on there. And it's all kind of, there's a lot of satire and action and everything in there. And it's all a little bit messy, but in a way that I find very compelling, right? Like it's not just like one coherent thing that's being said clearly. It's kind of a lot of stuff in there, but in the same way that a stew has lots of things in it, but it makes a stew that you like. As opposed to like a steak, right? Which is one thing done really well.
Yep. That's fair description.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, so go ahead.
well, I was going to say this is the satire in this is particularly relevant to me because this was one of the first R-rated movies that I was able to watch, which, at first you think, wow, this, because it is very graphic, but that's how my parents kind of thought of it, is like, this is so absurd, that, as long as like we, watch it with you the first time and kind of explain how it's over the top and like this isn't really, it they let me watch it. And because it's kind of done at this like surreal level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciated that going back and watching it is like, oh, like I didn't make the connection at the time. It's like sometimes when I look back on it, I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird, that like I don't think I watched it in 87, right? When
Mm-hmm.
I was 9, but probably 88, 89, like 10 or 11 years old. Um, but seeing that all that, it's like, okay, it is because of the hype, not even surreal, it's like hyper real, right? Like
Mm.
and
Well,
oh, and just so over the top,
heightened.
right?
Yeah, like
Heightened.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's not scary, it doesn't glamorize the violence, it's not scary violence, it's not grotesque, it's because even what things that could be grotesque,
Right.
like
Like,
getting your
well,
arms and legs shot off, aren't done that way,
yeah.
right?
So, I mean, it's very violent and pretty graphic, but as you mentioned, it's almost so over the top that it becomes cartoonish.
Uh-huh.
Case in point, the Ed 209 demonstration scene, which is amazing, and I want to talk more about it. But when this guy gets shot up by this machine gun, the amount of bullets they shoot into this guy who's so clearly already dead is just ridiculous, and there's no like realism there. It's
Right.
like it's just
even
it can't
even the
help.
way
It
the
starts feeling funny how many times they're shooting this guy.
right, even if the robot had broken in the way that they said, like it would not have done that to him, right? Like
Well,
it
at least it becomes like a joke, right?
right.
Yeah.
It's like, but if the only malfunction in it was that it could not identify that he was no longer a threat,
Mm-hmm.
like it still wouldn't shoot war machine guns into him when he is clearly dead. Like
Yeah.
that wouldn't be part of the design, right? Like that's just silly. It's
Well,
silly,
I mean,
right?
the whole point of the scene is that they are building these huge, expensive, lethal robots that don't even work very well. So they're not these precision instruments that move in like a scalpel and just do exactly the right thing. They're big, clumsy robots that fall down the stairs.
Yeah.
Like they're not good. Like, which does not stop them from being incredibly dangerous, but they're not very good at their designed purpose, which is like that's part of the whole point, right?
Yes.
Incidentally, the I heard once that supposedly the to the extent that we need one, the explanation for what happens is that because the office is carpeted, it didn't hear the gun hit the ground, and that's supposedly why it couldn't tell. So, for anyone who hasn't seen RoboCop, I mean, essentially the scene that we're talking about, they're demonstrating in a boardroom this gigantic machine. It's like 10 feet tall. It's got two gigantic machine guns on its arms. And they say, "Here, corporate stooge, point a gun at it just for pretend." And it'll say, "You have, please drop the weapon. You have 10 seconds to comply." And the guy's laughing and immediately drops it. It's like, haha, that's pretty funny, scary, right? But then it says, "Drop the weapon. You have 5 seconds to comply." And he's already dropped it. What can he do? And he starts running around begging for people to help. Nobody helps him. Everyone scatters. And then it just completely blows him away.
Right.
Which and they're in this boardroom, and it like he falls over on top of this pristine white model of the city that they're planning to build. um, it's all ridiculous. The window is shattered, and then immediately the concern of everybody in the room is not the death of the guy or even the mess that will have to be cleaned up, because it's not them that's going to have to do it. No, they're mad because the machine didn't work. It looked bad in the demonstration.
Yes.
We're
It's
supposed to
very,
present this to the generals tomorrow.
yeah. The corporateness of it is hilarious too.
Mm.
Yeah. Which I mean, it's just the whole thing. To your point, it's awesome and ridiculous at the same time. Like even in that demonstration, you would never load live rounds in that robot. Like
Yeah,
even if
so
you
they're
thought it
like,
was going to do what it was supposed to.
right. So this gives Miguel Ferrer the opportunity, as Bob Morton, the opportunity to say, "Hey, my backburnered project maybe gets more budget now if this isn't working." And so I can get slide in and skip a couple of steps in the corporate ladder here.
Yes, the opportunism is amazing.
Yeah.
So
And so, like, all of that's as much a part of the movie as the actual stuff involving Murphy as Robocop. But there's so much stuff, too. I didn't mean to cut you off because you were talking about this, like just the cartoonish nature. I kind of just wanted to chime in and agree with that. But
no, and you took it to a good place with that. But it's there's that scene, and then the honestly the scene where Murphy gets injured because that just like it shoots his arms and his legs completely. They shoot his
mhm.
arms and legs completely off with just regular artillery, right? Like it. I
Well,
mean, it can happen, but it's just like it's over the top, right? Because it has to be that way because he can't. He has to have
so
robotic
just
limbs.
a minor detail, but an amusing one, is that technically the criminals only shoot one of his arms off. But then when they're making him into RoboCop, Bob Morton comes in and the scientists are saying, "We were able to save the left arm." And he's like, "What are you talking about?" No, no, we said total robotization. No,
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
take off the living arm, put on the robot arm, like we talked about.
Yes, and then the final death at the end with the acid.
Yeah, that one's pretty gross.
Yeah, but also very over the top
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
and cartoonish.
Yeah.
So, but like I said, they took those three things. This boardroom annihilation, this guy getting dismembered, and a guy getting melted in acid, and it's the only one. It's like, yeah, okay, that acid was kind of gross. That's the worst you can say about it. But again, it's not grotesque. Like, it's not cringe. Like it's not watching like what's the newish genre, the torture porns, right? Like where it's like, oh god, like that makes me feel so bad,
Right.
but I kind of want to see it.
Hmm.
That it's like not even that. It's just silly,
Yeah.
you know.
It's more like
So
Evil Dead 2 or something. Or
very
not
much, yeah.
well, yeah, I guess it's like the rest of the movie is a different tone there, but yeah, just the point being that the violence is not meant to make us react the way, say, torture porn does, where it's supposed to
Right.
feel serious and scary in a kind of an exploitative way. This is just like it's all a big joke. it's all a cartoon, and it's meant to just sort of highlight the dystopian nature of this setting, that all of this crazy violence is just typical there.
Right. And then to your just to close out your point to the stew is that it it's not perfectly aligned with the satire and the banter that the characters have, but it
Mm-hmm.
kind of fits with it, right? Like they're sort of two separate things the movie's doing, right? It has this like humorous character banter, it's very satirical of society,
Mm-hmm.
and then it has this cartoonish violence, which are three independent things, but they all work together to make something that I
Mm-hmm.
like.
Yeah.
To finish your analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
So
All right, so that I think
RoboCop.
that's probably a good summary to start with RoboCop. We want to do that for Total Recall now.
Yeah, so Total Recall is it's not as near future, but it's still meant to be sort of close future.
Mm-hmm.
And
There's
it's
Mars
not
colonies and stuff.
right. It's yeah, it's meant to be kind of the natural extension of our development. It's
Mm-hmm.
not meant to be this like super sci-fi thing. Like it is still kind of grounded in like Earth is still very much like
Mm-hmm.
moving in the direction, whatever. So, but there are Mars colonies. Arnold Schwarzenegger is a construction worker who kind of is very intrigued by Mars, right? Like it's kind
Mm-hmm.
of like this. The bucket list probably wasn't a thing at the time, but
Well,
but it's I mean more than a bucket list, right? It's
yeah,
almost a
he has dreams about it.
he has dreams about it, right? So it's more than it's almost like an infatuation that he has with Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a new technology that comes out called Total Recall, where they can fake memories of vacations that you couldn't actually afford to go on or don't want to go on. And one of their selections is Mars. And so he, of course, gets drawn to that. And then the premise is that what ends up happening is that by messing around with Mars in his brain, he has a recall of, at the time it's not total recall, it's just a recall of an experience that he is actually somebody else, that they have masked his memory, and that he is actually this bad guy from Mars
Mm-hmm.
who is in like it's like witness protection, but not
Well, no,
exactly.
so
Yeah,
it like the plot is pretty convoluted, right? Like there's an
right. And
Act
that's why I don't
Three
want to get like all of
reveal.
it. Yeah,
Well, yeah, so there's an Act Three reveal about it, but yeah, so like the whole premise is that when he goes in for this experience, right? They tell him, well, you can of course have us implant the memory of just a perfectly nice vacation to Mars, where you see all the touristy things, like Olympus Mons and the galleries or whatever. But you can also have it be like an adventure, because we're just programming a story for your brain to remember, right? So we could make it be like you're there as a spy, and there's danger and action, and you get to have a memory of being this cool badass in an action story. And he decides, sure, I want to do that. But then supposedly something goes wrong, and it's aborted. Like they don't finish it. But then he starts encountering things that everyone's treating him like, oh, wait, you're actually this other person. There's people coming to try to kill you. Your own wife tries to kill you. There's all of this going on. And it does become clear that it's like this is playing out very much like the story he requested to have happen.
right.
And so uh, the big question then becomes: is he actually experiencing all of these things? Was it his real memories of being on Mars that were causing him to have dreams, and then the botched recall project that caused those memories to resurface, and then that's why everyone started going after him? Or is he just a schmo that went and paid for an experience that went bad in his head, and all of what we're seeing is only the recall vacation that he paid for?
Right.
And so that's kind of the big existential questions, based on a story by Philip K. Dick called "We Can Remember That for You Wholesale."
Yes. So it is, I mean, which the interesting part about it is it does leave, like you said, that sort of existential question on
Mm-hmm.
top of a movie that does also have some of the parts of RoboCop, right? Like there is still some over the top violence and sort of
Mm-hmm.
the glib way that they deal with a lot of that. Um, it's not as cartoonish. That's why I use the
Mm-hmm.
term glib, right? Like it's
Yeah.
like when he uses the other pedestrian, not pedestrian, but mall shopper or whatever on the escalator as like a human shield, and it's just like they keep shooting, and this guy's
Yeah.
just chest is like
Yeah.
exploding
Well,
with bullets, and then he
yeah.
discards him and like runs away. Like it's not that's not cartoonish in the same way that
Mm-hmm.
RoboCop is, but it's very glib. Like oh,
Yeah.
that guy was
It's
sort of he was an extra, so like
it
who cares, right?
very very pulpy sci-fi adventure stuff, right? And with a violent tinge to it.
Yeah,
And like there's a whole subplot too where there's slums there in Mars because a lot of the workers that didn't get radiation protection because they were just poor workers have started to get mutations, and so nobody wants them around, so they all live in the slums. And then they have to pay for their air, and the air gets threatened to be cut off. And that whole subplot, lots of stuff like that too. um,
yeah, that have this like societal, commentary that again, none of it's not perfect by any means, but
mm-hmm,
there's a lot of things in the mix that make this kind of fun.
mm-hmm,
And where this one sits for me, and is that this was the first movie where I recognized who Paul Verhoeven was,
mm-hmm,
right? Because now I was at an age where I was recognizing directors and writers and how their influence like shaped movies. And this one, because it was such a big box office, because it was Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it was super, again, hyper violent, and so there
mm-hmm,
was a lot of debate, just like always, about is this okay? Is this allowed to be in the movies? Should we allow kids to see it? Blah, blah,
mm-hmm,
all this kind of stuff. And he got attached to that in my mind. And, um, as, oh, here's this guy that's pushing the envelope, but in kind of an interesting way, right? That
right,
it's actually, so there's probably more to the story. Like it's obviously helped being written by Philip K. Dick, right? Like there, so it's got all these elements that it's kind of
mm-hmm,
commenting on, but also this cartoonish violence. It's got Schwarzenegger, who's got the presence that he's got, and
mm-hmm,
the banter, the one liners, like all that stuff, sort of in there. Like I mean, I when I had after college, my roommate was named Brian Richter, and I mean, it was never got old on like a Friday or Saturday night to be like, "See you at the party, Richter." Like it was just
mm-hmm.
everybody said it,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, like lots, and some of those lines were part of the whole discussion of like, well, is this in bad taste sort of question. Like for example, Sharon Stone plays his finger quotes wife, right? And at the point where
consider
he,
that a divorce.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So he has literally just shot Sharon Stone in the head, right in the center of the forehead. She's lying there dead, and he says, "Consider that a divorce." And it's again, it's like it's funny, but it is, it part of what's funny about it is not that it's a funny joke. It's that it's kind of like, wow, okay. That's part of what's going on. The Paul
Well, in the seat
Verhoeven
of the
is
party,
trying to push people's buttons there.
well, in the seat of the party Richter thing is similar. Like it's the guy Richter is talking about how they're going to make him back to his old bad guy self,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then he says, and I'm having this party later tonight after we fix you up. We're gonna you're gonna come and you're gonna be my guest with whoever at my party. And then he doesn't want, he fights him and doesn't want that to happen. It ends up they're fighting on an
Yeah.
elevated platform, a platform elevated, and he ends up falling off and he's holding Richter's arms and they come to a beam and it severs his arms.
Yeah.
And not only does he say, "See you at the party, Richter," like he throws the arms like at his falling body. Like
Yeah.
it's just so ridiculous. And like you said,
Hmm.
it's
Like, it doesn't even really make sense as a joke. It's just an absurd thing to say.
yes. Right, because he's not actually gonna see him at the party,
Yeah.
right? So,
But yeah.
yeah.
But there's a lot of really inventive stuff here, both in the violence and just in the like in the world building. Like Johnny Cabs are so like they are so perfectly on the blurry line between something that seems semi plausible and something that is surrealistically horrible. Because just like the faces of these robot Johnny Cabs are just like horrifying, but just in that uncanny valley way, like on purpose. It's like there's no reason for them to have a face, but if they're gonna have one, why would it look like that? They don't need to have a face, but they gave them a face that looks like that. It's horrifying. So that sort of stuff, and then all of the business with that weird mask, the 2 weeks, get ready for a surprise, the woman mask.
Yep.
And the early there's early on there's the like the big X-ray screen where we just see the bones and the highlighted guns coming through. Lots of really cool imagery there and just
Yeah,
fun
that's all
stuff.
good. Yeah.
Good action. Yeah. I will say that you know, there were people who probably knew better even when it came out, but I definitely know better now that, like, even though it's a sort of science fiction cliche of that, like, people blow up or whatever if they're exposed to vacuum, that's just not actually what happens. And so the long sequences with their eyes bugging out and their tongues bulging and everything, it's like does not work for me the way that it's supposed to, because I can't not think that that's not what would happen. And it's distracting now.
Yeah. The the only other thing with this, like all of the stuff is really interesting,
Mm-hmm.
with the society layers, the what is a memory,
Mm-hmm.
what it the freedom fighters in the lower society, the fact like the way that the air is managed, kind of like, I mean, it's very
Mm-hmm.
Chinatown, like the water and like all that, like they're basically treating it kind of like that.
Yeah.
All those things are so good. And then the alien thing, like it makes sense because of like what it but it's really that it's almost more like a MacGuffin at the end, right? Like it's
Well,
like we need something to give the people air.
yeah.
Give those
Well,
people air.
but I
Yeah.
think that that's kind of the whole point, though, right? Is that this idea is the version of the vacation that he paid for is the one where he does get to save the world. There
Right.
is a thing that you can do that just fixes the problem, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to real life, where so often there are no, like, it's not just like, oh, well, it's really hard to get to that button, but if you can press it, everything's good now, right? That's just not how things really work, but it does in a spy story that you might pay for example. And
Interesting.
so,
I never connected it to that. Like you're right. That makes so much more sense. Like in
mm-hmm,
the that if you look at it from that perspective of like furthering the
mm-hmm,
conflation of like whether this is actually the spy story
right.
or is the movie, that does work perfectly, right? Because he does save the world, he gets the girl,
Mm-hmm.
he yeah, everything works out. Yeah, that makes
Well,
sense.
I just really love one of the things that I love the most about this movie is that it really kind of does the Inception ending before Inception, in the sense that it is steadfast in its refusal to commit to one answer or the other, right? Because there's the one big scene where the guy comes to him and says, I'm the scientist that has started this whole process on you, and you're reacting badly, and I'm here to try to help you calm down so that we can bring you out of the machine. This is all a dream, pointing out how all of the things that are happening to you are just like the story that you paid for. This is the whole thing. But of course, we have Quaid, our Schwarzenegger's character, thinking like, okay, that does sound plausible, but it's also, if this is all real, it does also seem like something they might send someone to say to convince me to swallow a poison pill or something. So, which is it? The stakes could not be higher, right? And so, in that scene, he's not sure, he's questioning, but then he sees the scientist is sweating. And he says, ah, that must mean that he's lying. Therefore, kill him. We're committed that it's real, and we're moving forward from there. And he doesn't question it again after that, right? But it only takes half a step away from that to say, the scientist is on the verge of losing one of his patients. Maybe he's just nervous that it's not going to work. Like, why does it, like, that's, just because that persuades Quaid doesn't mean that that's an objective truth now, right? It could still just be that didn't mean anything.
Right, because he treated him more like he was a hologram,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then, so he would be robotic and
Right.
not be able to sweat,
Well,
right?
and
Like
he's
I know he
like,
didn't say that, but that's like kind of how he
he
like,
assumes that would be the case.
right,
Yeah, because it's like, for all we know, like, this process of inserting someone into the existing ongoing dream, we don't know how that's supposed to work. For all we know, he only looked like he was sweating because Quaid, in his own head, decided that he would be in the subconscious, and he made it happen as part of the dream.
right.
Right? Like, so the movie, I think, although that is the scene that persuades Quaid that it's all real, I don't think that the movie intends us to believe, oh, that proves it, therefore it is all real. I think the intention is throughout to say, we don't know, and the movie has decided that it's not going to tell us either way, and I love that.
Yes, I do love that too. So
Yeah. Um, and it is just like, it's it feeds lots of YouTube videos and essays and everything of someone saying, like, what's the truth, what really happened, and at a certain point you want to kind of just say, the ambiguity was the actual point. So, and I think that's pretty clear. So the idea of finding out which one is true is going to be someone just making stuff up anyway,
right.
you know. But yeah, so I think that there's a lot of fun stuff in Total Recall. Um, but I would say that just at a high level, I think it is a movie that I enjoy, but is not at the same tier as RoboCop and Starship Troopers are for me.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm glad I interjected it
Mm-hmm.
because I haven't been as, you know, steadfast about following up with Philip K. Dick as you have, which of course you aren't. You just
I,
have
I
watched
I
other,
just
listen to other
know.
podcasts. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I did know that was true, but I have not read the story.
Right.
I've read some Philip K. Dick, but not that one.
Yeah. So I, I guess we're transitioning into the sort of Philip K. or the Paul Verhoeven.
Yeah. Well, or
Oh, you were talking
well,
about Philip K. Dick. Sorry.
yeah.
I
Okay.
jumped to like the Paul Verhoeven.
Oh, sure.
Never
Yeah.
mind.
So
Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
I did listen
I
to a
was
podcast series where they were talking a lot about it, and so there was a lot of discussion points brought up
right.
there. But
But
um,
you were referencing it in relation to other Philip K. Dick stories, not other not as your favorite Paul Verhoeven movie, right?
oh, well, I was mentioning it in this
Oh no,
case,
you did.
and
Yeah, okay, yeah.
yeah. So in
I'm
this
like
case, what
I
I was
thought I
saying is, Total
right because you
Recall
like RoboCop and
compared to
Starship Troopers.
RoboCop and Starship Troopers is a movie that I enjoy, but it is not at the same level as those other two. That
Yes.
for
Okay.
me.
So I confused myself twice.
Okay.
You were fine.
Okay, but
Yes,
now
and
this is
so
what we agreed on ahead of time: is that the podcast that we were going to record was this. Are you remembering now that the? No, I'm
no, I'm good. So
anyway.
I would, but that, so my original point is the same. So I'm glad we rewatched this. I'm glad we put this in here because I must have said it wrong. So as of Paul Verhoeven movies, I was not as familiar, you know, with having rewatched these, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so Total Recall always has like this heightened like place in my mind because
Mm-hmm.
of like how fun it was when I first saw it, how I have probably seen it more often than the other ones because
Mm-hmm.
it makes the rounds more. But watching them in context of thinking about it from that Paul Verhoeven lens, you're right. RoboCop and Starship Troopers are, in my mind, the two that are kind of competing for like what is the ultimate,
Mm-hmm.
as silly as whatever that is.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I think the big piece of it is that there's lots of fun to be had with Total Recall. It's a good movie. I like it, but I don't think it has as much to say as RoboCop or Starship Troopers do.
and what it does have to say, you can honestly you can attribute it to Philip K. Dick because it's the plot points that he instilled into the story for the most part. Yeah.
Although my understanding is, again, I haven't read the story. My understanding is that the plot is actually pretty different. You know, the only
Oh,
real
okay.
piece of it that's in common is just the idea of implanting the memories and not being sure what's real. So the actual most of the details of the plot are new, I think.
Okay, well that's good. So I think
Mm-hmm.
he'll get credit for that.
Yeah.
But it's still, you're right. I do believe that it has now come down to your original
Mm-hmm.
presentation, which of these two is the ultimate movie
Yeah.
before I interjected this movie.
Right.
So
And
that's kind of
we
yeah.
should maybe talk about Starship Troopers in broadly a little bit, just even though we did it a whole podcast about it, just in case anyone hasn't listened to that episode or haven't thought about it in a while. I mean, I think what we kind of talked about that's really interesting about Starship Troopers is that it is fundamentally a subversion of the source material compared to like it is adapting a book by Robert Heinlein, and by playing the source material straight, it is actually satirizing it, which is kind of amazing.
Yes.
And it does a lot of things that, like in a superficial way, could almost come across as like you know the cast and the acting don't always necessarily feel super nuanced. There's a lot of just stuff that feels kind of a little bit exploitative or surface level, but in a lot of respects all of that's kind of intentional as part of what the broader message of the movie is trying to say, which is that this whole sort of jingoistic fascist light military government setup and permanent war is maybe not good. So,
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I'll be curious, as you sort of work through which of these two is your most representative of Philip K. Or no, I keep saying that because we kept
Paul
saying it so
Verhoeven.
much of
Well,
Paul Verhoeven.
and I think it's a valid question to say what question are we asking precisely, right? Because
Yep,
like is the question which one is the most representative of him as a filmmaker versus which one is the best movie, and even by best movie, what metric are we measuring that on? Are we talking about most entertaining, most interesting, most influential? Like all of these are valid facets of the discussion, I
exactly, and that's why I sort of punted to you and said,
think.
"Here's how you work through it," because that's where I'm really torn. Because if you're going off, if you're going to take Paul Verhoeven as a filmmaker and you're going to look at his influence on film,
Hmm.
then it goes back to I feel like I rightfully introduced Total Recall because I think that RoboCop to Total Recall to Basic Instinct kind of arc has a has way more influence on filmmaking as a whole versus what Starship Troopers does. And RoboCop kickstarts all that, right?
Hmm.
Like Total Recall and Basic Instinct just kind of are more mainstream. They kind of get that those types of things out there more. But how that changed what was acceptable in filmmaking, which again, he like moved the Overton window, right? Like I know that's an overused term, but this is a perfect example of it. Is he took these things to a certain point, and it's not like all filmmaking went there, right? Like it just shifted what was like, okay, well, it's okay to be now here because he made a lot of money and success, and people like these movies over here. And so from that standpoint, RoboCop is more important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think of the things that he does really well after rewatching RoboCop, like the the banter, the stuff. I mean, even there's things in there that I didn't even get when I last watched this movie. I mean, there is some of the cleverest dialogue and just back and forth like at a level that's just unbelievable that carries through all of his films, right?
Mm-hmm. Well,
I
and just
like
little nuanced pieces like the fact that what's her name, the partner, I can't remember her name at the moment, but the way she figures out that it's Murphy is because Murphy liked to do the like quick draw spinning his gun
yeah,
around thing because it was his kid's favorite TV show and he wanted to be able to do it like that to impress his kid. And then when she sees RoboCop do that, she knows it must be him. That's just a cool way to have that plot happen.
yes. And then and then I start to get, and as I'm continuing down that line of thought, like uh, there's there's things I like about RoboCop better. One of the things that has always been one of the things that has made me not maybe not enjoy Starship Troopers as much as you do is I just movies, and it's almost it's I feel like it's almost in the same realm of my like superhero thing, like when it's just so over reliant on like these massive set pieces that are all
Mm-hmm.
special effects, like it loses me a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
that's just a me thing.
Yeah.
And but I don't feel like I should penalize Starship Troopers because RoboCop utilized state of the art special effects at the time. It just happened to be that that was in 87 versus in
Mm-hmm.
20 whatever. Um, so I liked that better. It just it feels more pure to me, which is not fair to Starship Troopers. And then what I would say is I think Starship Troopers is probably his most clever movie, to your
Mm-hmm.
point about taking something, not changing it, but changing the
Yeah.
entire perception and the tone of it by doing exactly what it was doing, but just instead of
Mm-hmm.
taking it off the page, when you put that into the real world, it's like, wow, this is actually absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And it's incredibly clever what he does there. And it has the banter, it is funny, it has the sort of, you know, comic violence, like it has all the pieces of a Verhoeven movie that I don't I don't know, but that's sort of that's how I got to where I am,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
So I'm going to jump back in on some of that stuff too, but it
mhm.
just occurred to me when we were talking about the various facets um, to try to find out what was actually Paul Verhoeven's most successful movie from a box office standpoint.
So can I take a guess since I don't know this?
Yes. So the numbers I have here are absolute, not adjusted for inflation, but go ahead.
I I was gonna say Basic Instinct, but I Starship Troopers might have gotten it. Nah, I'll go with Basic Instinct and I'll just take that guess and you tell me.
You are correct. With a total worldwide box office of 352,700,000, Basic Instinct is number one by a significant margin. Number two only had 261 million compared to 352 million.
Is
Uh,
that Total Recall or Starship Troopers?
Total Recall. Number three at 191 million is Hollow Man.
I could see that, even though it's terrible.
Well,
Not terrible. Terrible's a bad. It gets a bad rap,
it's
and it's not.
disappointing, is what
It's
it is.
disappointing, yeah.
I
But
did
it did have
rewatch
Kevin
it as
Bacon, and it
part of
was
this whole
yeah.
thing, and like it's like it was better than I remembered it, but in such a just cheesy way. It feels exploitative in a way that a lot of these others manage to avoid.
Right. And I
Um,
don't know if that's Kevin Bacon, if he was riding too high on his success after, because like it was literally like I think it's the next movie after Total Recall and Basic Instinct, right?
so Starship Troopers was 97 and Hollow Man was 2000 and there wasn't anything in between.
What came after Basic Instinct? Was it Starship Troopers?
Basic Instinct was 92 and then Showgirls was next,
Yeah, I forgot about that one.
which did not make very much money at all because that movie it's not good, but it can be enjoyed on its own on its own merits.
Yeah, but that's actually the movie that's probably more of what I was considering was happen is that,
Mm-hmm.
he has this he comes on the scene with RoboCop and then
Yeah.
he just Total Recall, Basic Instinct just absolutely like skyrocket him. But
Mm-hmm.
then you think just looking I don't know him, but just looking at the data, right? Like, okay, I did really well with these like sci-fi violence things, but as soon as I made one that was like had some intrigue and some
Mm-hmm.
sex in it, and it's like, well, I can just do more of that, right? And I'll make money and this can be easy. And it just didn't. And I'm going to take, again, you can see in his mind, like, I'm going to take the girl from Saved by the Bell and I'm going to make her, that like, it's just like you can see it happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it just didn't work.
Although
And then it
what
goes back to the sci-fi. Like there's almost that like rubber band of like, oh well, I'm actually better at this. Let me go to that. Back to
So,
Starship Troopers.
one thing that I had a movie that I had not seen before I was watching the whole filmography along with the Blank Check podcast was um, Flesh and Blood is the movie he made before RoboCop, and it's a Rutger Hauer movie, and I had not seen it, but it's kind of fascinating to watch because it's definitely far more amateurish compared to even RoboCop, comes next, only 2 years later, but it's pretty ambitious, and you see a lot of his particular stylistic uh, ticks are there already. Certainly, the violence and the sex. Um, it's not bad. It's interesting to watch in context. I would not make it a high priority unless you're especially interested in Paul Verhoeven, but it's interesting in that level. But so next after Hollow Man is Starship Troopers, and then RoboCop is pretty low. It's like less than half of that. But of course, RoboCop actually didn't really do very well in its first theatrical run. It was only kind of became popular later, like
Yeah,
on
that
video and
one was
stuff.
one that what you would take now is like what for the kids these days when once it goes to streaming. But back when we used to have to go get stuff at
Well, they
Blockbuster
started
or
making cartoons and action figures and stuff for it, and
well,
then of
yeah,
course
once you could
sequels.
go rent it,
Yeah.
then it became popular because
Mm-hmm.
people were like, this is weird sounding. I'm not going to go spend my money in the theater, but then okay, I'll get the video, and then it sort of started to pick up this,
Yeah.
Malcolm Gladwell tipping point sort of thing where it's like enough people all of a sudden started to do it and the word of mouth spread. And then, like you said, next thing you know, it's in cartoons, which is odd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly not the only time that's ever happened, but it's probably, I think, I'm not sure I can think of a more egregious example of a movie that is not remotely suitable for kids being marketed to kids. Like, there are other examples of that happening, but I think this one is perhaps the most dramatic disconnect. I mean, like, what would be next, even?
I don't even know. I can't even think of another example, which you said you could.
Well, there's a billion movies that ended up with weird Saturday morning cartoon versions of them, like A Team and uh,
Which is
Ghostbusters,
not.
and I mean Ghostbusters is kind of an example, right? Like it's not a kids movie, and then they made it, kids properties about it. But in any case, that's a rabbit
Yeah,
trail we don't
different
need to
thing.
follow. Um,
Or we could at some point.
well, yeah, we could. We
Yeah.
could. I think though that it sounds like we are coming around to agreement though, because as much as I really like Starship Troopers, and I think it does some really neat stuff with the concept, and as much as I think it's kind of laser focused on saying kind of one specific thing in a couple of different ways. And it's almost so effective at that it kind of becomes a little bit slick, right? Almost like it's neat rather than impactful.
Yep.
And certainly, it is also a movie that there are lots of people who were able to watch it and entirely miss the point, and only just say, "Yeah, get those bugs! Yay, humans! They're afraid! Ha ha! We win! Bugs suck!" And it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. um, I think it's good. It's great. I love it. It's a great movie, but kind of like what I was saying with RoboCop is kind of almost by virtue of its satire and story and the stuff it's doing being a little messier, it gives you a little bit more sort of traction to think about it. And like, what does this mean? Like, what is this movie's opinion on the police, for example? It's not easy to exactly nail out. It's like, well, it's saying this because it's kind of saying a lot of things, and it's not, um, you know, it's not incoherent, but it's complicated. It's nuanced, and there's kind of a lot of interesting things going on there. It's very fun, it's exciting, but it's also just like you are left with things like the very end, we're victorious. Ronnie Cox's character is can't be arrested because he's a company, and RoboCop has the secret fourth order that he can't arrest a member of the company. So the other guy says, "Hey, you're fired," and then now we can shoot him out the window. And hooray, we win. And they say, "Well, thank you, RoboCop." He says, "The name's Murphy." But think just for a second about the real ending. First of all, the guy who just got shot out the window wasn't the big boss. It was his boss that just fired him, who is still in place, still running the company. Like, the corporation's not going anywhere. It was basically they were able to shift all the blame onto one guy who's dead now. And then for as much as RoboCop says, "Oh, the name's Murphy," like, he's not Murphy. He still has all these orders in his head. He barely remembers anything about his former life. He doesn't have full agency. Is he Murphy? Not really, or it's certainly not the way he was before. And so even as much as it kind of presents that like a victory, and it is kinda, it's a messy victory that leaves us thinking about it. And so it's uh like, there's funny stuff in Starship Troopers, but I think RoboCop is just more
It's
iconic and interesting.
yes, I agree with that. I think, like you said, we landed in the same place for almost exactly the same reasons.
Yeah.
But even you're just talking about some of those things, like,
Mm-hmm.
it just reminds me just how much more influential RoboCop was on, like, not just film in general, which, like, his those that series of three films was, but even like when you look at those other films like Total Recall, like, it has a lot of those same concepts of, like, it's kind of saying these things, but it's complicated and you're not sure, and there's some ambiguity and some vagueness. Basic Instinct has that too. A lot of people forget that. But there's the whole, like, relationship between Sharon Stone and Michael Douglas. Like, that's a super complicated relationship when, like, he's starting to realize that, like, she did do this, and, like, but they're still like each other, and then there's the reveal that she definitely 100% did do it and might do it to him, but then she decides not to because she likes him, and it's like, well, is that good? Like,
I feel, so what I see, Basic Instinct is another one where I think that there is actually, it's another one where there's actually a lot of ambiguity about what
that's
is
what I
it.
was saying.
Yeah, what is it precisely that happened at the end? Because on the one hand, we're set up with a semi plausible explanation for maybe it was actually this other woman that did it, but she's dead now and can't confirm it. And it doesn't explain some of the other pieces of what happened. I in the blank check podcast episode of it, the guest on that episode, I don't remember who it was, but came to the conclusion I like the most, which is that they were actually in on it together. The two women were.
That does actually probably solve all the mystery. Yeah.
Well, it the only piece that doesn't work is that we just really have no evidence of them communicating in that way, except in that if they were working together, they could accomplish all the other things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Anyway, but that's not what we're here. I mean, but my point was that there's
Hmm.
people forget, like Basic Instinct has sort of some cultural like iconic moments, and people forget that there's this whole intricate plot that is actually what made it interesting.
Yeah.
Right? Like if it had literally just been Sharon Stone crossing and uncrossing her legs in an interview room, it wouldn't have gotten the same traction as like, oh, that happens and it's interesting and it's kind of like there's still a mystery at the end and you're not really sure and you don't get what these people are, why do they like each other, but you
Hmm.
kind of get it but you kind of don't like yeah,
You know, it's funny because that one shot in Basic Instinct is such a prime example sometimes of how sometimes complicated movies get distilled down to really just one shot in them that kind of just becomes the whole of the conversation.
yeah. I've always felt like when not that, again, we're not going down a whole Basic Instinct thing. I always feel like the more iconic shot of Basic Instinct is the one where she puts the knife down when she's
Hmm.
sleeping with him,
Yeah.
and like that sort of that moment of like, whoa, wait, okay, like, but it's almost like, again, it's like the sweat bead. It's like it's not 100% saying it was her, but it's like definitely she's got something going on, but she like,
Hmm.
we knew he liked her, and so he was kind of like giving her some leeway, but now she's giving him leeway by not killing him. And like the complexity of like what your brain does like in that scene,
Hmm.
I feel is like more iconic than just the one that everybody talks about, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well, and I mean, a little bit of Basic Instinct conversation certainly doesn't hurt because we're talking about Paul Verhoeven movies, and as just established, that one was actually his most successful from a box office standpoint. So by a significant margin, almost a full third more than second place.
yep, which I guessed it.
So I think we have decided then that RoboCop is the winner. Um, it actually just reminds me of um, a similar film debate that I saw presented that was supposed. People were arguing that Jaws or Jurassic Park, like which of those two. And on the one hand, I think my instinct says Jaws, but Jurassic Park does do an awful lot of impressive things that you have. You can, I mean, that's a hell of a movie as well. But I think it's not quite as like pure as Jaws is.
Yeah, it's an interesting head to head because
Mm-hmm.
what Jaws did more with less, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Jurassic Park had the ability to like make the big scary
The
dinosaurs.
scope is much bigger in Jurassic
Yeah,
Park. Yeah.
yeah. So
But so in any case, I think perhaps now we should discuss what we want to do for our next episode. And as you and I briefly mentioned off the recording, but we can bring up now, is that just today, as we record this, the BFI Sight and Sound magazine has just put out their new listing, two different lists actually, of the greatest films of all time. One is a poll from a bunch of film critics, and then the other one is a poll of a bunch of film directors. And so they have two lists that there's some overlap, but one of the differences between this list and the AFI's is that it's a lot of not American movies, which is one of the things that we talked about, with the AFI list, is that it is a list of American films, and that necessarily leaves out a lot of really amazing films that just weren't made in America.
It
Um,
also has some more modern films than the AFI had.
mm-hmm, it's true.
Even with the new list,
Mm-hmm,
there's still a bias towards movies that were made before 97.
mm-hmm.
Um, well, yeah, do you have that link on your computer? Can you drop it in the
Uh,
chat? I had it on
yes,
my phone. So if we're gonna
no
look at this,
problem. I will do that right now. So I think the critics list is the one that I've got here, but there's a link to the director's one from that link. Um, so I think what we talked about here in advance was not necessarily just deciding that's our new list and we're going to go through and do all of them, but that at least to start with, we would each go through and choose one of the movies that we haven't seen before that looks interesting, and then those two we would do next, and then see how we feel about it from there. Um, One of the notable things, I think, looking at it, is that looking at the top five, and in fact, even just number one on the critics list is a French a film from France and Belgium that I've never heard of. It's called Jean Dielman 23, Quai du Commerce 1080 Bruxelles. And my understanding is that it says it is a magnificent epic of experimental cinema offering a feminist perspective on recurrent events of everyday life. And number two and three on this list are Vertigo and Citizen Kane. So that's the list that this is on, and that's the movie they put at number one. So the fact that I've never even heard of it immediately makes me want to say, what is that movie?
yeah. So is that yours?
I mean, it's certainly the one that I feel like I want to see what that is. It may not be the most exciting watch in a conventional way, because my understanding it's kind of what is sometimes called like slow cinema,
Mm-hmm.
meaning it's a little bit more like, it says experimental, but it'll do things like uh, you know we're just watching her do stuff in the kitchen, and then she'll actually walk off screen, and we just hear sounds of her doing something off camera for a little bit before she comes back and just continues doing stuff in the kitchen, and that's the scene. Like I don't even know if I'm exaggerating here. That's just kind of the basic, like, surface level impression that I've gotten. Um, so I mean, it's number one on this list, with some a list that has a lot of other really amazing movies that I have seen, and they put this at number one. I want to know what that is.
So one thing I thought even further about is maybe if we do this and we want to continue it, maybe what we do is alternate back and forth
Mm-hmm.
between movies we've not seen at all that we're going to watch because of this,
Mm-hmm.
and movies that we have seen but we have not watched in this context that
Mm-hmm.
are on this list.
Yeah.
So like we can do this one, we're going to see two crazy new things, but then maybe next time we can watch, like, just as an example, like, because they can think like Get Out,
Mm-hmm.
right, and
Yeah.
discuss it in this context,
Right.
right?
So Get Out
Even
on
we've
this
seen.
list, right? And
Yeah.
so I agree. And like one of the other ones that I thought about in that context is The Third Man, which is one of my favorite
Yep.
noir movies, but wasn't on the original AFI list. I guess technically speaking, it might be because it's a United Kingdom movie, although some of the AFI list movies felt like they were really stretching that anyway. So,
Yeah. That
but
way we're not just kind of pounding along on things that are like
I
these.
think we do want to try to keep it mixed up a little bit and not just have every episode be foreign movies that nobody's heard of.
Right.
Which also theoretically we might want to look into, like, are these going to be available to watch?
Yeah, so we can be more, we can kind of let's just get out the gate with a couple that we
Hmm.
are interested in, and then we can kind of define it a little bit more, probably offline, and then come on to the podcast with a better plan. But I think there's a way to do this because, like, I mean, like, was Mulholland Drive wasn't on the top 100, right?
Uh, well, not on the AFI list, no.
Right,
And
and it's on
actually, I would
number
love
eight
to
here.
revisit that one because that's one that I saw in the theater in 2001 and said, weird, and then never watched
It's
it
still
again.
weird,
Yeah.
and
So I just mean the fact that on this list, it's number 8 out of
right,
everything. Like, that makes me say, maybe I ought to revisit that movie.
yeah, and there's some. Did we do a Miyazaki one? I can't
I
remember.
mean, we've talked about Spirited Away.
Right, but there's my neighbor Totoro's on this. Like, so
Hmm.
yeah, there's things that we've seen that were definitely would be fun to rewatch.
Yeah. And it's
Um,
interesting. I think of the two, My Neighbor Totoro is maybe more accessible to people. Like it's got weird stuff in it, but it's a little easier to follow and to process for people who might not be as
I agree.
versed in some of
I agree.
uh, the Japaneseness of Spirited
Bye,
Away.
Mo. Sorry, my dogs are going to their dog sitter. We're leaving tomorrow, so I had to say
Okay,
goodbye.
sure. But yeah, there's lots of good movies in here. Like there's some that we've talked about in the context of like our Oscar casts, for example. Like Parasite is on here. Um, Moonlight, I think, is on here.
Yep.
But yeah, so there's lots of good ones to choose from. I do have to, we've had this conversation because Vertigo was on the list, but Vertigo is number 2 on this list, and I can't help but say like that's not even my fourth favorite Alfred Hitchcock movie. But I guess I understand that lots of people like Vertigo more than I do. Like I don't think it's bad. I just think he's done better ones, in my opinion.
Yeah, it just has. I don't know. It's whatever. Um, so I have two movies
Okay.
that I'm actually, while you were talking, I'm trying to see, can you, all right, one is definitely more accessible than the other, even though,
Yeah, that's
so
going to be the trick because the website here where this list is has a link for the BFI player thing, but unfortunately that's a UK only thing. So if someone wanted to try to use a VPN, for example, that might be something. But like it's also technically it's one of those where like wink wink, right? Not really supposed to do
I'm,
that.
yeah, I'm not even going to get in. Remember, I used to live in the UK, so I'm
Yeah.
all about knowing how to
Yeah.
maneuver VPNs both directions.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I'm in
Mm-hmm.
the UK watching college football in the States, and when I'm in America watching
Mm-hmm.
before NBC picked up soccer and all that stuff. But anyway,
Well, so the good news is that Gian Dillman number one is readily available on Prime Video. So
and I
rentable for
actually
three
looked
ninety
mine
nine.
mine up incorrectly, so both of mine are available.
Okay.
So I'm two that really caught my eye
Mm-hmm.
that I have heard about before are The Passion of Joan of Arc.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mostly because I've heard so much about like her performance in it, the actress that
Mm-hmm.
plays her, because it's a silent movie, and it supposedly is like, just the emotiveness of how she like conveys this is really
Mm-hmm.
good. But then I've also heard a lot about this movie, The Night of the Hunter.
Oh, The Night of the Hunter is a great movie. I watched it for the first time just this last year. It's I would love to talk about that movie
Okay, well, I have not seen it, so it counts still.
for sure. Yeah.
So let's do Night of the Hunter
Uh huh.
and what I can't even pronounce I
Yeah.
forget the
Jean
number one.
Dielman 23 Croix du Commerce 1080 Bruxelles. I'm guessing at the French pronunciation there, but like the title is not translated. It's my guess. It seems like that's a name and an address is my guess. Um,
Got it.
but But yeah, so that's available on Prime Video for people to find. And then Night of the Hunter, I think, is available at lots of, all the normal places.
Perfect.
So Night of the Hunter on this list is tied for 25, um, and of course Jean Dillman, as we just said, was number one. So we're going to watch those two movies next, and so we will be back to talk about those two films. But in the meantime, everyone, watch good movies.
Watch good movies. Yeah. So.